This is the new 2024 Maserati GranTurismo, and I want to like it because I really like the MC20, but I'm just surprised, mainly because the new GranTurismo looks a lot like the old GranTurismo, which came out 15 years ago. The difference is the new one costs $230,000, whereas you can buy the old one for like 14 grand at the kind of used car dealer that also sells S-classes with broken air suspension. Anyway, let's look at the quirks and features. Today's video is brought to you by Cars and Bids, my online enthusiast car auction site that recently sold this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Check it out at carsandbids.com. All right, time for the quirks and features of the new Maserati GranTurismo, starting with a little overview. So, the GranTurismo first came out back in 2008. And the original one lasted all the way through 2019, and then Maserati pulled the plug and they canceled it. Now, a lot of people thought it was just going to die completely because it had been on the market for 12 years, mostly unchanged, sales had really slowed down, and they didn't directly replace it. But after 4 years of working on it and thinking things over, Maserati came out with the all-new GranTurismo for 23, which looks a lot like the original GranTurismo that had come out 15 years earlier. In fact, I was astonished when I first saw them reveal this car online. I wasn't sure if they were even being serious because the design was so old and they had so long to think about it. 15 years, including 4 years where the car wasn't on the market at all, and they were just planning, and they came out with a new GranTurismo that looks mostly like the old GranTurismo. But it's worth pointing out that the old GranTurismo was generally praised for its beautiful styling by most people. And so Maserati must have figured, hey, we're gonna come out with a new one, let's keep this design that most people like and just modernize it. And so that's what they did to create the new one. But while the exterior design of the new GranTurismo may look like the old one, there's a big change under the hood. The old car had a V8, sounded like a V8. This car has a V6. It's the same powertrain from the Maserati MC20, their mid-engine supercar sports car, and it's offered here in 2 different flavors. The base model, which is called the Modena, has about 480 horsepower, or you can upgrade to this version, the Trofeo, which has about 540 horsepower. That is a pretty significant figure. Now, all GranTurismo models have all-wheel drive, an 8-speed automatic transmission, and 0 to 60 is about 3.7 seconds for the Modena, and probably in the low 3-second range for the Trofeo with its extra power. And supposedly, an all-electric version of this car is coming soon with an amazing 750 horsepower. That will be a sight to see, but I will believe it when I see it. As for pricing, the new GranTurismo is expensive. A base level Modena starts from $160,000. You upgrade to the Trofeo, it starts from $192,000. And that's before options, which are plentiful, and you'll want to add them. For example, this car has a driver assist package that's $8,300 extra that has all your typical driver assist features that you would expect and want. And so if you just add basics like that, you're already over $200,000. The sticker price of this particular one is around $230,000, which is big money for a Maserati GranTurismo. And next up, we move inside the new GranTurismo. I'm going to start with the key that lets you inside. The key is pretty cool. It's leather wrapped in aluminum. It looks neat. On the back, there's a Maserati trident. On the front, you don't even really have buttons, just sort of areas to press, which seems classy. One thing I love here, you can see there's a spot to open the trunk, there's a spot to unlock the doors, and then there's a spot to lock the doors, and that's just the Maserati logo. But apparently Maserati realized that might be too complicated for some people, so they also put a little lock icon there next to the Maserati logo in case idiots were confused about the Maserati logo locking the doors. You also have a separate lock icon. But you walk up to the car to open the door, you stick your hand into this door handle area. It's not a traditional door handle. There's just a rubber electronic popper there. You press it, the door pops open, and then you open it up. And in case you're inside the car and you want to get out, you also have an electronic popper instead of a door handle. This circular button looks pretty nice. You push it, the door electronically opens, and then you can climb out. And just in case you're worried that popper mechanism might break, there is a manual door release located here in the door storage pocket. You can pull on that to open up the door manually and climb out if your popper has failed. But anyway, next we're inside the car where there are some rather unusual and bizarre controls and, well, quirks and features in here. We'll start with the clock, which is an analog clock, but it's digital, which is definitely weird. And then the bezel around the clock, which looks like it has some function, it doesn't. It doesn't move, it doesn't do anything. Very strange. More on the clock in a minute. First, we move on to the glove box. You can see it's here, but how do you open it? There's no latch, there's no button. I thought maybe pressing this Italian flag would open it up, but it doesn't. Instead, the glove box control is located in the screen for the climate controls. This lower screen that only adjusts the climate controls, you press here, and the glove box opens, which is certainly odd. And speaking of that lower climate control screen, doesn't it seem excessively complicated? There's just a lot of different climate control functions on this screen. Some cars get away with all of their climate controls in like 2 dials and 2 buttons. Here, it's this whole massive screen. So I'm looking into this and I discover the primary reason why it's so complicated is they've added other stuff to the climate controls, not just the controls themselves. For instance, in the climate control screen, you can change your ambient lighting color and your ambient lighting brightness. Strangely enough, your seat memory is also integrated here into the climate control screen. And if you want to turn on your headlights, well, guess what? Take a look in the climate control screen, and that's where your headlight control is. But the weirdest is undoubtedly the clock, which you can adjust here in the climate control screen. You tap on the clock icon, and then you have choices. For one, there are 3 different designs available for the clock display. You can choose between sort of a traditional digital, a sportier one, and then this cool design clock if you're kind of a funky design person who wears weird eyeglasses. But you don't just have to have a clock displayed in this screen. You can also have it show a compass, as you can see, or a G-force meter to show your G's, which is pretty cool, or the strangest one, a screen that shows if you're braking or accelerating. Your brake or accelerate, that can be on there, and it'll show you exactly how much of each pedal you're using, the throttle or the brake. That's very strange, but in case you want that information, instead of knowing the time, you can do that in this car. So that's weird. But anyway, also unusual in the center control area, your gear selector is in here in 4 horizontal buttons: park, reverse, neutral, and drive. Now, it's odd enough that the buttons are located here. It's even stranger that you have to tap them really hard to make them do anything. You gotta really push down on the buttons. As you can see, a simple tap won't work. And the drawback here is it's pretty easy to be pushing hard and then accidentally also tap the climate controls and accidentally adjust something. This has already happened to me twice while using this car, and it's a little bit of a weird placement and operation of all of this stuff. But that's how they've done it. But anyway, since we're in this center control stack area, next let's move on to the infotainment system, which actually is pretty good. It's reasonably intuitive to use, fairly simple to go between the menus, and pretty responsive to your touch when you're moving around the navigation map. All that stuff is fairly simple. The home screen is also pretty good, very customizable. You can have it show pretty much whatever you want to see on your main home screen in a multi-panel display, which I always like. And it also includes Android Auto, Apple CarPlay, Amazon's Alexa voice assistant, fairly normal stuff, and it operates in a fairly consistent and decent manner. Overall, it's a decent infotainment system. And next up, since we've covered the screens in the center, let's talk about the gauge cluster, which is also a screen, just like it is in most new cars. The gauge cluster screen here in the new GranTurismo is actually surprisingly decent. There's a lot of configurability here. For one, you can configure 3 different displays of the gauge cluster. There's a traditional traditional display, there's like a newer, sportier one, and then there's a relaxed display without as much stuff. But beyond that, you can also configure various different panels in the gauge cluster. Over on the left side, you can choose between a lot of different pieces of information. So like the music you're listening to, the date and time, tire pressure and temperature, all that stuff you can see over on the left side. You can also configure the display panel in the center screen to show various other information like the speed you're traveling, a full screen map, and various other information in the center. And that way you can have one configurable item in the middle and another on the side. You can choose exactly how you want this gauge cluster to be displayed, which is pretty nice. And there's still another excellent screen in this car to cover, and that would be the rear view mirror. You have a traditional rear view mirror, as you can see, but if you flip this switch, it becomes a camera, which allows you far better visibility in the back, especially because this is a fairly tight sports car with smaller windows. Can't really see out of it, but with that switch flipped, you can see everything. I also love the fact that these shift paddles are stuck on the steering column instead of the wheel, so they don't change positions even if you're in a corner, and they're metal. They feel good, feel nice to press, to pull. That's how it should be in a high-performance car. And speaking of high-performance car, another thing I like, you have this carbon fiber trim here in the center, and that even extends to the wireless cell phone charger, which looks like it's charging on a bed of carbon fiber. It's actually a rubber surface that's meant to look like the carbon fiber trim, but it does a pretty good job of continuing that look, even though it's changed surfaces, materials, and purpose. It's nice. Also worth pointing out one other interesting item, that would be the steering wheel, which has a lot of buttons on the left side to configure various different items, especially that heads-up display and the gauge screen. On the right side, you have your cruise controls over here and some other stuff. You also have two buttons sort of hanging off the center. To the left, that would be your engine start-stop button, and to the right, that's your drive mode. You can twist to adjust between 4 different drive modes, from sort of a basic around-town cruising mode to Corsa, which is race mode that brings on all of your hardest suspension settings and your best exhaust note. Take a listen. And next we move on to the back seat in the GranTurismo, which is actually better than you might think in terms of amenities. And I guess that's because this is supposed to be the grand touring car in the lineup, whereas the MC20 is the real sports car. They figure people will buy this if they really do want to use those back seats, and so they made them pretty usable. Still tight back there, but you do have a climate vent, as you can see, which is pretty nice. Unfortunately, the adjustment only goes up and down, not side to side, but it's the thought that counts. You also have 2 cup holders back here, which is pretty nice and convenient for rear passengers, and you have USB ports for charging devices, both USB-A and USB-C in the back, which is pretty nice. One thing that especially impressed me in the back seat is that Maserati even went to the trouble of wrapping the seatbelt buckles in leather for the rear seat passengers. That's not going to be seen or used all that often if we're being totally honest, but they did it to make sure it's the classiest experience possible. Now, also worth pointing out in the back, obviously it's 2 individual seats. The central panel can be removed, but it's not an armrest. Instead, it's sort of a flimsy panel that just pulls off and reveals a hole, an opening into the trunk where you can have a pass-through for skis or larger items if that's what you want to do. And next up, we move on to the trunk in the GranTurismo, which interestingly is power operated. You don't always see that in exotic cars, but since this is a Grand Tourer, you have this nice power operated trunk, and same deal when you want it to come down. Just push the button and it automatically comes down and closes. A nice luxury car touch. Now, as for the trunk itself, nothing particularly unusual back here. Exactly the size that I would expect for this type of car. You do have a little charge port over on the side of the trunk, which is neat, and under the floor you have some tools and a can of Fix-A-Flat. There is no spare tire in this car. Otherwise, the trunk is fairly standard, nothing particularly unusual here. And finally, let's talk through a few interesting exterior quirks and features of the new Gran Turismo, starting with badging, the Maserati emblem. Maserati has a very cool logo, the trident emblem. It looks cool, and so Maserati uses it basically everywhere they can, including some unorthodox spots. You can see it on the rear pillars behind the side windows, one trident on each side, which isn't what most brands do, but if you got a logo that looks like this, I guess you do it. You also have the Maserati logo on the front, and then a second Maserati logo also on the front, right below the first one. The second one is also a radar sensor for all the driver assist tech. I can't think of too many cars that have one logo stacked on top of another logo, but this one does. Then look into the headlights. You can once again see the Maserati trident and the Maserati script, again reminding you what this car is. Even on the seat belts, you have the Maserati trident logo. Very small, but it's there. Always a reminder of this car. And the other interesting exterior design element with the new Gran Turismo, aside from, well, its similarity in style to the old one, the rear view mirror camera positioning. I mentioned I love that rear view mirror camera, but the camera is located here in this housing, which is, well, it just doesn't look all that good. It's too tall, it's too big, it doesn't fit with the beautiful sweeping flowing lines of the car. It's nice to have that rear view camera, but you look up there and you think, at what cost? It's definitely an odd spot to have it and a little obtrusive. And with all that in mind, now it's time to get behind the wheel of the new Gran Turismo. Let's see how it drives. All right, driving the new Gran Turismo. And it does look a lot like the old Gran Turismo, but it drives reasonably well. I think there are going to instantly be complaints from people about the fact that they have switched from a V6, from a V8 to a V6. I don't like those complaints. I have driven V6s with the right tuning and turbocharging and hybrid assist that drive even better than V8s. And this one is pretty stout, actually, with over 540 horsepower. That's a pretty big number, and it's just quick. I mean, you tap on it and you get absolutely excellent, yes, I'm over the speed limit, I appreciate that. You tap on it and you get absolutely excellent throttle response like you do in a V8. It really feels like that. Now, the noise in a V6 is never going to quite be what a V8 noise was, especially because this car had a really great V8 noise. That was one of the only, if I'm honest with ourselves here, that was one of the only real benefits of the Maserati Gran Turismo in years past. The noise of the V8 just was so excellent. It sounded so good. That's not gone from this car. They've done a good job of making the V6 sound good, but it certainly isn't like it once was. Now, it's also worth pointing out the ride quality here is fairly harsh. I have it in sport mode, but not Corsa mode, which would be even harsher, of course. And it's kind of rough. You'd want to be in normal mode, or GT as they call it, in order to really take advantage of a smoother kind of GT-like ride quality. And indeed, if you're in the GT mode, it does feel more comfortable, noticeably more comfortable. But the drawback is that you can instantly tell that throttle response has been loosened, and so you kind of have to choose between those two. Now, I will also say that the steering and handling is pretty good here, despite this car's length and despite its appearance like the old one, but it definitely feels sharper than the outgoing one, which already felt actually fairly sharp for what it was. It feels tighter, the steering is tighter, it handles better, and there's a surprisingly small amount of body roll when you go around corners, which is especially impressive for kind of a long car, like a long coupe. This is ultimately a four-seater. It wasn't intended to be a true, focused sports car, but it actually steers and handles pretty well. When I'm driving this car around in sport mode, I do feel like this has more of a sports car feel to it than a touring car feel. It definitely feels more focused and more performance-y. Now, given that Maserati also sells sedans and SUVs, that's probably what they were going for. This is the sports car, even though it's really the GT car. And I really am surprised with the handling in this car. The steering a little bit less so. It's a little over-assisted and it's not quite precise enough. You make quick steering changes and the car doesn't quickly change direction necessarily. You got to go a little bit further with the steering in order to do that. It's reasonably linear. It just takes a little bit more input than a lot of true sports cars, I would say. Now, as far as a around town kind of daily driver car, I think this does a reasonably good job of it. Again, it's a little bit more high strung than I was expecting. It's not quite the touring car that I think some people think of when they think of this car. It's a little bit more sport and performance, but that's fine. And it's fun to drive, and that adds a little bit of enjoyment to your daily existence, as opposed to some of the other Maserati models where the real benefit is the brand name. This car really does have the performance to back it up. It feels strong, it drives fast. You do lose a little bit in terms of the ride quality, but it is surprisingly fun. It's actually interesting because I think this car is significantly better in terms of driving experience than the outgoing car. It just looks like it. And it's kind of a shame that they made it look similar to the outgoing GranTurismo, especially when they had 15 years to dream up a new design, because this car deserves better, if that makes sense. Like, it is a better car than the old GranTurismo, and I think a lot of people are not going to think of it that way just because it looks so similar. It really is a totally revamped, totally different, totally better driving experience and driving feel. You wouldn't necessarily know that from the outside, where it almost just looks like an update. Overall, I am pretty impressed with this car. I wasn't really expecting to be. Maserati has not made a lot of compelling cars recently, and this particular one, given the price tag and given the look, I was like, okay, here's another swing and a miss from Maserati, but actually this car is nice to drive. And it almost backs up the price tag. Not quite. And at the end of the day, it's still a Maserati, and so these are going to lose value fast, and they're going to be offered with deep discounts. They just overproduce the number of vehicles, frankly. And so that will kind of hurt the car, but I have a suspicion in 3-4 years, this is going to be a pretty good deal, and it's certainly head and shoulders better car to drive and to use than the outgoing GranTurismo. And so that's the new Maserati GranTurismo. There's a lot to like here, but I suspect this car won't be a big hit. Enthusiasts will prefer to buy the MC20 sports car. People looking for something practical will get one of Maserati's SUVs. There's just not that big of a market for a big coupe that costs $250,000 anymore, especially one that looks like it's from 2009. Anyway, now it's time to give the new GranTurismo a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 64 out of 100, which puts the new GranTurismo Trofeo here against relevant cars. It beats out the old GranTurismo by a lot, which is good, but otherwise it ends up in a fairly low position here, behind several variants of the Porsche 911, behind the new Aston Martin DB12, and behind the new Corvette Z06. The GranTurismo's problem is that it's too expensive for what it offers, which is something of a mix between an exotic performance car and a big luxury coupe. The market doesn't seem that interested in cars like this, particularly at the GranTurismo's price point, and I suspect it's going to be a tough sell, although I will admit it's more competent than I was expecting, with decent technology and surprisingly sharp handling.